3,000 years ago, the civilized world collapsed. The palaces of the Mycenaeans burned. The empire of the Hittites disappeared. In Egypt, invasion fleets descended, and only Ramesses III held the line. This was 1177 BC, the year the Bronze Age ended. But this series is not about the fall. It's about the survivors. The forgotten scribes who preserved memory, the traders who rebuilt shattered networks, the mountain kingdoms that carried civilization through the dark. In this series, we uncover the men history overlooked, the ones who ensured that when the old world died, a new one could rise. The night the world burned. Imagine every city on Earth goes dark tonight. Not a blackout, not a war, not one country failing, all of them. Every trade route, every port, every palace, every system that keeps people fed, gone within a single lifetime. That happened 3,000 years ago, and nobody saw it coming. This is the Bronze Age collapse, the most complete civilizational wipeout in human history, and almost nobody talks about it, because the people who survived barely understood it themselves. Stay with me, because this story doesn't have a clean ending. First, you need to understand what was lost, because most people picture 1200 BC and think primitive, mud huts, tribes with spears. Wrong. Dead wrong. By 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean was running a fully integrated international economy, diplomatic mail systems, standing professional armies, written peace treaties between rival superpowers, merchant fleets crossing open sea on scheduled routes. This wasn't primitive. This was sophisticated. This was connected, every part depending on every other part in ways that made it powerful. And that same connection is exactly what made it fragile. Here's the map. Northern Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Hittite Empire. These are not barbarians. They have iron, they have law courts, they have diplomats. In 1274 BC, they fought Egypt to a complete standstill at the Battle of Kadesh, one of the largest chariot engagements in recorded history. And then they did something almost no ancient power ever did. They sat down and negotiated, in writing. Both sides signed, the world's first recorded peace treaty. That's who the Hittites were. Down the Levantine coast, modern Syria, Lebanon, the city of Ugarit. Think of Ugarit as the Singapore of the ancient world. Every morning in that market, you'd hear 5 different languages. Egyptians next to Cypriots, next to Mycenaeans, next to Canaanites, all moving copper, timber, grain, purple dye. Purple dye. It took 10,000 sea snails to make a single gram, 1 gram. That's the scale of wealth flowing through one city on one coast. And it all depended on a system that was about to crack. Further south, Egypt, New Kingdom Egypt under Ramesses III, the most stable state on earth, a bureaucracy running continuously for over 1,000 years, an empire stretching across 2 continents, and across the Aegean, the Mycenaeans. You know them from Homer, Achilles, Agamemnon, Troy. But here's what most people miss. Homer wrote those stories centuries after the Mycenaeans were already gone. He was writing mythology about a world that had become a ghost story. In their own time, the Mycenaeans were dominant, massive stone fortresses, bronze weapons exported across the entire sea, walls so enormous later Greeks assumed giants must have built them. They called them Cyclopean walls. Now, here's the thing that holds all of this together, the single material the entire system runs on: bronze. Copper plus tin. Simple formula. Devastating dependency. Copper comes from Cyprus, but the tin? The tin has to travel from Central Asia, thousands of miles, overland, through multiple kingdoms, multiple middlemen, multiple points where everything can go wrong. Every sword, every shield, every plow, every hinge on every palace door depends on that chain staying intact. The moment it breaks, everything breaks with it. The ancient world knew this, which is why they spent generations building relationships, treaties, marriages, trade agreements, all designed to keep the tin moving and the system running. It worked. For centuries, it worked brilliantly. And then, around 1200 BC, it stopped.
The first signal is drought. Scientists reconstructing ancient climates from pollen cores and lake sediment have found it. A sustained multi-decade drought hitting the eastern Mediterranean starting around 1200 BC. Not a bad harvest, not one hard year. A fundamental shift in rainfall patterns lasting generations. When the rain stops, the grain stops. When the grain stops, the palaces can't feed their people. When they can't feed their people, they can't pay their armies. When they can't pay their armies, the borders open. And that's when it gets worse. We have letters from this exact moment, real dispatches on clay tablets that survived because the cities around them burned, and the heat baked the clay harder. One tablet from Ugarit, sent to the king of Cyprus, reads like this: "Enemy ships have come. They burned my towns. 7 ships appeared off the coast. Destruction everywhere. I am trapped. Send help immediately." The reply never came. That tablet was found still in the kiln, still being fired when the city fell. Think about what that means. The administrators of Ugarit were still functioning, still drafting letters, still following protocol when the end arrived. Not a slow fade, not a managed retreat, a cliff. Ugarit burns around 1185 BC and is never rebuilt. Not conquered and repopulated, gone. When archaeologists dig there today, they find ash, collapsed walls, the evidence of violent destruction. And then, nothing. Silence in the dirt for centuries. Ugarit is not alone. And then they appear in the historical record. Suddenly, violently, almost without explanation. The Sea Peoples. The name comes from Egyptian temple inscriptions, specifically the walls of Ramesses III at Medinet Habu. Enormous carved reliefs showing naval warfare. Ships locked together in brutal combat, archers firing from shore into tangled enemy vessels. And alongside those images, hieroglyphic text describing what Ramesses says he faced. He writes, "The enemy countries conspired in their islands. All at once the lands were on the move. No land could stand before their arms." Then he lists what fell. Hittite Empire, gone. Carchemish, one of the great cities of the ancient Near East, gone. Cyprus, gone. In one sentence, like a roll call of the dead. Ramesses claims he stopped them. His temple walls show triumph, prisoners kneeling, enemy ships capsized, the God King victorious over chaos. But here's what the temple walls don't show. Egypt after. Egypt wins the battle. It does not survive the aftermath. Within 50 years of Ramesses III's death, the empire is fracturing, foreign territories lost, trade networks collapsed, treasury drained, the priests of Amun accumulating more real power than the Pharaoh himself. You can win the battle and still lose everything. Egypt is proof. Now, who were the Sea Peoples actually? That question has consumed historians for 2 centuries. The Egyptians called different groups by different names: the Peliset, the Checker, the Denyen. Some of those names may match peoples we know elsewhere. The Peliset might be the biblical Philistines, but the identifications are contested because the Sea Peoples left almost no records of their own. Here's the theory that reframes everything.
What if they weren't invaders? What if they were refugees? If the collapse is already happening, if Mycenaean palaces are burning, if Hittite granaries are empty, if the tin stops moving and the bronze runs out, the people living there don't simply vanish. They flee. They take their families, their weapons, their ships. They go looking for somewhere that still functions. What looks from the Egyptian shore like a monstrous invasion might look from the other side like desperate people with nowhere left to go. The truth is probably both. Displacement creates pressure. Pressure creates conflict. Conflict creates more displacement. A spiral, accelerating, each wave making the next one worse. And in the middle of it all, the Mycenaeans disappear. The palace at Pylos, one of the great Mycenaean administrative centers, shows something haunting in its final archive of clay tablets. Coastline watchers being posted, emergency grain redistribution, rowers conscripted from inland villages to man the fleet. They knew something was coming. They were preparing. It didn't matter. Pylos burns around 1180 BC. Like Ugarit, the tablets survived because the fire that ended the palace baked the clay perfectly. The records of a civilization's final desperate preparations, preserved by the catastrophe that destroyed it. The population of Greece drops by an estimated 75% over the following century. 75%. 3 out of every 4 people gone. And then the strangest thing happens. A dark age descends, not metaphorically, literally. For roughly 400 years, Greece has no writing, almost no monumental construction, almost no long-distance trade. The archaeological record goes quiet in a way that makes historians deeply uneasy. When writing returns to Greece, it's a completely different system. Nobody remembered Linear B. Nobody remembered the palace economies. Nobody remembered the Mycenaean world. The Greeks of Plato's time were separated from the Mycenaeans by the same distance that separates us from the fall of Rome. They built their civilization on ruins they didn't understand. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, and this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. We don't have one cause. Drought, sea peoples, internal rebellions, trade network collapse, earthquakes, systems failure. Every explanation is partly right, and that's exactly the problem. It wasn't one catastrophe. It was everything at once. The drought fractured agricultural surplus. That broke the palace economies. That disrupted the trade routes. That stopped the tin. That slowed bronze production. That weakened armies. That opened borders. That let the pressure in. And as each piece fell, it made every other piece more vulnerable. A civilization built on global supply chains, interdependence, specialized production distributed across dozens of kingdoms with no redundancy. Sound familiar? Historians call this systems collapse, the principle that complex, interconnected systems don't fail gradually. They reach a threshold, and then they fail completely, all at once, faster than anyone thought possible. The Bronze Age collapse is the oldest and most complete example in human history, and we built the modern world on the same blueprint. Here's what I haven't told you yet. Not everything died. The Phoenicians, seafaring traders of the Levantine coast, survived and adapted. They replaced the old palace trade networks with something more resilient, decentralized merchant relationships with no center to collapse, just ships, traders, and trust. Harder to destroy because there was nothing to target.
Those Phoenicians spread a simplified writing system designed for merchants, not palace scribes, across the Mediterranean. That alphabet became Greek. Greek became Latin. Latin became the letters you're reading right now. The entire Western alphabetic tradition traces back to people who adapted when the old world burned. In Greece, after 4 centuries of silence, new city-states emerged, not palace economies, something smaller, more distributed, more resilient, the beginning of what we would eventually call democracy. Every one of these innovations is a direct response to the collapse. Every one is a solution to the problem that Bronze Age civilization couldn't solve. And here's what strikes me about all of them. None came from the powerful. None came from generals or palace administrators or kings who controlled the old system. They came from people working in the ruins. History remembers the empires that burned, the Hittite capital consumed by fire, Ugarit's harbor going silent, the Mycenaean palaces collapsing into rubble no one would clear for centuries. It remembers the sea peoples arriving on their ships, the fallen palace walls, the darkness that followed. But it forgets the men who refused to let the light go out, the traders who rebuilt the sea routes, the scribes who kept writing when the kingdoms were gone, the survivors who carried civilization through the dark, not because anyone asked them to, but because they understood something the empires had missed. Systems fall, people carry forward. Every civilization that came after, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Israelites, Rome, every one of them is built on decisions made by ordinary people during the collapse, not kings, not armies. Ordinary people choosing to preserve something, carry something forward, keep one small flame going in the dark. You are the product of that choice. The alphabet you read, the legal concepts you take for granted, the idea that civilization is worth maintaining, all of it traces back to people who refused to give up when the world ended. The Bronze Age collapse asks one question that no inscription answers. Who kept the light? That's the story we're going to tell. The Pharaoh who held the line. The world just ended. You watched it. The tablets still baking in the kiln at Ugarit. The Hittite Empire erased from the map in a single generation. The Mycenaean palaces collapsing into rubble nobody would clear for centuries. And we left with one question sitting in the air. Who kept the light? One man, one kingdom, one last wall standing between what remained of civilization and the dark. His name was Ramesses III, and what he did next, by every reasonable measure, shouldn't have worked. Put yourself in Egypt, 1186 BC. Ramesses has just taken the throne, and the intelligence reports coming in are catastrophic. From the north, the Hittites are gone. Not retreating, not weakened, gone. The capital burned. The royal dynasty vanished mid-sentence from the historical record. Egypt's rival superpower, the one state powerful enough to sign a peace treaty as an equal, erased. From the Levantine coast, trading partners Egypt had maintained for centuries are going silent one by one. Ships dispatched to collect grain shipments aren't returning. From the western desert, Libyan confederations massing on the border, testing, probing. And from the sea, reports of enormous fleets moving south along the coast, not merchant vessels, warships, burning everything they touch. Most leaders facing that picture make defensive calculations, pull back, fortify the delta, hope the storm passes before it reaches Egyptian soil. Ramesses looked at the same intelligence and made a different decision. Egypt would not just survive the collapse, Egypt would be where it stopped. History flattens pharaohs into symbols, the golden mask, the colossal statue, the name carved 40 feet high into temple walls. Ramesses III was a real man under real pressure, and he'd been under pressure since the moment he took power.
The pharaoh before him had spent his entire reign just reunifying an Egypt fractured by internal chaos. Ramesses inherited a kingdom that had barely stabilized, that needed time. It didn't get time. Within his first years on the throne, the Libyans attack from the west. Ramesses repels them. They come again. He repels them again. 2 major Western campaigns before the main event has even arrived. By the time the Sea Peoples appear on Egypt's northern horizon, this man has already been fighting for years. He wasn't a king who stumbled into a crisis. He was a king the crisis had been building toward.
Now, the Sea Peoples, moving south with a momentum that has already swallowed the Hittites, Ugarit, Cyprus, the cities of the Levantine coast. But here's the detail that changes everything about how you understand what Ramesses was facing. This wasn't just a naval invasion. The Sea Peoples were attacking on 2 axes simultaneously. By sea, massive fleets sailing south, raiding ports, cutting Egypt off from its northern trade networks. By land, enormous columns moving overland through Canaan. And these land columns weren't just soldiers, they were families, ox carts loaded with everything a community owns, women, children, elderly, the possessions of people who have decided there is nowhere left to go back to. This was not a raiding party planning to take what it could and retreat. This was an entire world in motion. You can defeat an army. You can negotiate with an army. You can pay an army to leave. You cannot negotiate with people who have nowhere to return to. Ramesses understood the difference. His response was built around that understanding. And that distinction is exactly why Egypt survived when nothing else did. What Ramesses constructed in response wasn't just courage, it was a coherent military strategy executed under impossible pressure. First, intelligence. Egyptian records from this period show extensive use of coastal watchers and scouts. Ramesses knew the fleets were coming before they arrived. Direction, scale, timing. That advance warning is the difference between a prepared defense and a massacre. Second, he chose his ground. Rather than meeting the Sea Peoples in open water, where their numbers gave them every advantage, Ramesses positioned his forces at the mouth of one of the Nile's branches, narrow channel, restricted water, exactly the geography that turns an enormous fleet into a crowded, tangled problem. He didn't go looking for the fight. He built a trap and waited. Third, combined arms. Egyptian archers on the shore firing down into enemy ships, Egyptian warships grappling enemy vessels from the sides, preventing retreat, soldiers boarding from multiple directions simultaneously. The Sea Peoples had momentum, they had numbers, they had the wreckage of every civilization they'd already destroyed behind them, giving them confidence. Ramesses had ground, preparation, and discipline. But the sea was only one front. Simultaneously, the land columns pressing through Canaan toward Egypt's northeastern border, the ox carts, the families, the weight of displaced peoples moving with the grim momentum of people who have already lost everything. Ramesses met them before they reached Egyptian soil. 2 battles, 2 fronts, both held. And here's what that meant in the context of the world you've been watching burn throughout this episode. Every other line had broken. Every other kingdom, every other palace, every other army that had stood in the path of this displacement, gone. The Hittites, with all their iron and all their diplomacy and all their centuries of imperial experience, gone. Ramesses held where empires had failed. Now, a word about what we're actually looking at when we read these inscriptions. The Medinet Habu temple is extraordinary, some of the most detailed military records from the entire ancient world, tactically specific, emotionally vivid, a genuine primary source for one of history's most dramatic moments. It is also royal propaganda,
written by Ramesses' scribes, carved by Ramesses' artists, filtered through the political needs of a pharaoh who needed his people and history to understand that he alone had saved Egypt. The victories are real. The archaeology confirms the broad outline. Egypt survives, the delta holds, the administration continues. Those aren't things you fabricate in stone. But the completeness of the triumph, the image of Ramesses as the singular divine force holding back chaos, that's the propaganda doing its work. Because here's what the temple walls don't carve. Egypt after. The foreign empire, gone. Territories in Canaan, lost. The trade networks that had built Egyptian wealth, collapsed. The treasury drained by years of continuous military campaigning. Ramesses won the battles. He could not win back the world those battles had been fought to preserve. That world was already ash before the first Egyptian arrow flew. Here's what almost every military history account of Ramesses misses completely. The battles were remarkable. The naval engagement at the Nile mouth is a genuine tactical achievement worth studying. But the battles are not why Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse when the Hittites didn't. The bureaucracy is why Egypt survived. While Mycenaean Linear B script vanished completely, no one left who needed it, no palaces left to administer, while Hittite royal archives simply end mid-sentence, while city after city lost the institutional knowledge that keeps complex societies functioning, Egypt kept writing things down. Temple records, tax records, granary inventories, labor rosters, the mundane, essential, completely unglamorous documentation of a state that is still operating. That sounds like a footnote. It is not a footnote. Systems collapse when the knowledge of how to run them disappears. The palace at Pylos burned and took its entire administrative class with it. That knowledge, who manages what, where the grain goes, how the irrigation system works, who owes what to whom, gone forever. Egypt's administration survived because Ramesses treated its preservation as a military objective alongside the battles themselves. He didn't just fight the sea peoples, he fought to keep the lights on inside Egypt while he was fighting them. That is the real reason Egypt outlasts the Bronze Age collapse.
But here's what the inscriptions will never tell you. Ramesses III, the man who held the line against the greatest military crisis the ancient world had ever seen, nearly died at the hands of his own household. The Turin judicial papyrus, discovered in the 19th century, a court record from late in Ramesses' reign documenting a conspiracy trial, a plot to assassinate the pharaoh, organized from inside the royal harem. Multiple high officials implicated. The conspiracy came close enough that Ramesses may have died from wounds sustained in the attempt. Historians still debate it. Think about that. The external threat stopped. The sea peoples repelled. The Western Libyans twice defeated. Every enemy that came at Egypt from outside held. And the thing that brought him down was the pressure building inside. The treasury strained, the old wealth gone, the empire that had made Egypt rich finished. Internal tensions finding the cracks that years of warfare had opened in the institution. The wall held against everything outside it and cracked from within. Ramesses III is the last pharaoh of the New Kingdom who holds genuine imperial power. After him, slow decline, priests accumulating authority, territory contracting, the great building projects slowing, the machine still running but with less fuel, less reach, less certainty. He saved Egypt. He couldn't save the world Egypt had been part of.
The interconnected Bronze Age system, the tin routes, the copper fleets, the palace economies, the diplomatic marriages, the clay tablet correspondence between kings who called each other brother, that world is gone. Ramesses preserved one piece of what had existed inside it, one flame in an enormous dark. But here's what that flame lit. Because Egypt survived, its records survived, its writing tradition survived, its institutional knowledge survived. And into that surviving fragment of the old world, new peoples would come. Traders rebuilding sea routes the policies no longer controlled. Merchants carrying a new, simpler writing system across the Mediterranean. A civilization was about to emerge from the ruins, not despite the collapse, but shaped entirely by it. Built by people who learned from everything that burned. The question we started with, who kept the light? Ramesses is part of that answer, but only part. The rest of the answer is coming.
The scribes who saved memory. The palaces are gone. Ugarit, ash. The Hittite capital, rubble. The Mycenaean fortresses, empty stone that future Greeks would assume giants had built because no living person could explain who had. Ramesses held Egypt together with military discipline and bureaucratic stubbornness, but even Egypt, the last wall standing, lost its empire, lost its trade networks, lost the world it had existed inside. Everything powerful enough to fight back, fought, and still lost something. So here's the question that's been sitting underneath this entire story. How does anything survive that? Not armies, not kings, not palace walls 6 meters thick. How does knowledge survive? Because it did. Somehow, through the burning, through the silence, through 4 centuries of Greek Dark Age and the erasure of entire writing systems, enough survived. Enough that the civilizations that came after could build on something instead of starting from nothing. That didn't happen by accident. Somebody carried it through. Before we talk about the people who saved it, you need to understand what nearly died. Not treasure, not gold, not the kind of thing you can dig up and redistribute. Accumulated knowledge, the kind that takes generations to build and one catastrophic generation to lose forever. Think about what the Bronze Age scribal class actually maintained. Agricultural calendars calibrated to specific regional flood cycles, irrigation system schematics, medical texts, mathematical tables, astronomical records tracking planetary movements across decades, legal codes, diplomatic correspondence archives preserving the terms of treaties stretching back generations. None of this existed in any single location. None of it was backed up anywhere. Every piece of it lived inside the institutions, the palace archives, the temple libraries, the scribal schools that the collapse was systematically destroying. When the palace at Pylos burned, it didn't just kill the people inside, it killed everything those people knew. The irrigation engineer who understood exactly how the water management system for that valley worked, gone. The physician who had spent 40 years refining treatments documented on palace tablets, gone. The astronomer tracking a 40-year cycle of Venus observations, gone. The diplomat who held in his head the full context of a treaty negotiated 3 generations ago, gone. Knowledge doesn't just live in documents. It lives in the people trained to read and use those documents. When you lose both simultaneously, you lose the ability to recover what was written even if you find it. The Linear B tablets from Pylos survived the fire. We can read some of them today, but the scribal tradition that produced them, the training system, the institutional context, the living knowledge of how that writing system worked,
gone completely. It took modern scholars decades of painstaking decipherment work to crack what Mycenaean palace scribes taught to students in an afternoon. That's what was at stake. That's what almost died.
Egypt is where you start, because Egypt is the clearest example of institutional survival in the ancient world. The Egyptian scribal class was not an accident. It was a deliberate, multi-generational investment in the infrastructure of knowledge. Scribal schools, the Egyptians called them the houses of life, attached to major temples across the country, not just in the capital, not just in one centralized location that a single catastrophe could eliminate. Distributed, redundant, multiple nodes in a network, any one of which could carry forward the tradition even if others were disrupted. Students entered young, training lasted years. The curriculum covered not just writing, but mathematics, medicine, astronomy, law, religious ritual, administrative procedure. A fully trained Egyptian scribe wasn't just a copyist. He was a walking institutional memory. And here's the structural decision that saved everything. Egyptian temple institutions were legally and economically separate from the palace system. They had their own land grants, their own income streams, their own administrative hierarchies that didn't depend on the pharaoh's treasury functioning at full capacity. When the palace economy strained under the weight of military campaigns and lost trade revenue, the temples kept running. When the Farid Empire evaporated, the temples kept running. When the treasury tightened and court officials scrambled for resources, the houses of life kept writing things down. Medical papyri copied and recopied through the collapse period, mathematical texts preserved, astronomical records maintained. The Ebers Papyrus, one of the most comprehensive medical documents from the ancient world, dates from this period. Someone decided, in the middle of civilizational collapse, that the medical knowledge of previous generations was worth the papyrus it took to preserve it. That decision is why we have it. Now, Egypt is the obvious case, the big institution that held. But here's what most accounts of the Bronze Age collapse miss entirely. Not every city burned. Ugarit burned, yes, but not every city on the Levantine coast was destroyed. Some survived, some adapted, some continued functioning, reduced, changed, operating in a completely transformed landscape, but continuous. Byblos, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world, a port city on the Lebanese coast that had been trading with Egypt for over 1,000 years before the collapse. Byblos survived, damaged, diminished, its palace economy gone, but continuous. The scribes at Byblos kept working. And here's what makes that extraordinary in context. The scribal tradition at Byblos wasn't just copying texts for the sake of preservation. It was actively adapting. The cuneiform writing system, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay that had been the administrative language of the entire Near East, was becoming obsolete. The palace systems that had used it were gone. The diplomatic network that had made Akkadian the international language of correspondence finished. Something new was needed. And in the surviving cities of the Levantine coast, in the scribal workshops of places like Byblos, something new was being built. An alphabet. Not the first attempt at alphabetic writing, that credit goes earlier, but the Phoenician alphabet that emerges from the post-collapse Levantine coast is the system that spreads. Simple enough for merchants to learn without years of palace schooling, flexible enough to represent multiple languages, efficient enough to write on materials lighter and cheaper than clay tablets. A writing system designed for a world without palaces. The old scribal class maintained knowledge within institutions. The new system put knowledge in the hands of anyone who could learn 22 characters. That is not a minor technical upgrade. That is the most consequential information technology shift in human history before the printing press.
Here's a detail that archaeology keeps turning up and that almost never makes it into popular accounts of the collapse. Some archives were deliberately preserved, not accidentally surviving in fire-hardened clay, deliberately protected, moved, hidden, carried out before the destruction arrived. At multiple sites across the eastern Mediterranean, archaeologists have found evidence of archival materials that were relocated, sometimes multiple times, before final deposition. Clay tablets wrapped and stored, papyrus documents moved to interior rooms, libraries consolidated before abandonment. Someone was making choices about what was worth saving. That means someone, in the chaos of collapse, with cities burning on the horizon and refugee columns moving past the walls, was still thinking institutionally, still thinking about the future, still asking the question, if this city falls, what does the next civilization need to find? We don't know their names. The scribes who made these decisions left no monument, no inscription, no record of themselves making the choice. The record is just the texts, surviving in places they shouldn't logically survive. Evidence of intention without evidence of the person intending. They saved things knowing they might not survive to explain why. Think about what that requires. The palace is failing. The food distribution system is breaking down. The military reports are getting worse. The refugees arriving from the north are describing things nobody wants to hear. And somewhere in that chaos, a scribe is carefully wrapping clay tablets in cloth, deciding which ones matter most, choosing what the future gets to know. That is not a bureaucratic act. That is a moral one.
So what actually made it through? Mathematical knowledge. The Babylonian mathematical tradition, place value notation, geometric calculations, algebraic problem solving survived the collapse period in Mesopotamia, which was disrupted but not destroyed in the same total way as the Western Bronze Age centers. That mathematical tradition would eventually reach the Greeks, and through the Greeks, us. Astronomical records. The continuous observation of celestial cycles, critical for agriculture, for navigation, for calendar keeping, was maintained in Egyptian temple institutions through the collapse and beyond. The astronomical knowledge that underlies the calendar you use today has a continuous thread running back through the collapse period. Medical knowledge. Egyptian medical papyri preserved surgical techniques, pharmacological knowledge, diagnostic procedures that wouldn't be matched in Europe for over 1,000 years. Some of what survived in those documents was genuinely not rediscovered until the modern period. Agricultural knowledge. Seed varieties, irrigation techniques, soil management practices specific to different regional conditions. This is the knowledge most vulnerable to institutional collapse. It lives in practice, in accumulated local expertise, in the heads of farmers and agricultural administrators. Some of it was lost forever. But Egyptian temple estates, operating continuously through the collapse, preserved enough that the agricultural recovery of the post-collapse period had something to build on. None of this is glamorous. None of it fills a temple wall with heroic carvings. But every one of these threads running through the collapse is a decision someone made, a choice to write something down, a choice to copy it again, a choice to carry it when carrying it meant extra weight on a dangerous road. Here's the image I want you to hold. Two simultaneous realities, same moment, same catastrophe. A Mycenaean palace administrator in the final hours before Pylos burns, pressing a stylus into clay, recording a grain shipment, following protocol, doing his job to the last moment, not because it will save anyone, but because it's what he knows how to do. That tablet bakes in the fire, survives, sits in the earth for 3,000 years, gets excavated, gets partially read by modern scholars who spent careers deciphering a dead script, tells us almost nothing useful because the context that made it meaningful, the institution, the people, the living knowledge, is gone. The document survived, the tradition died.
Simultaneously, in a surviving Levantine port city, a scribe is teaching a student a new writing system. 22 characters, no vowels marked, simple enough to learn in weeks rather than years. The student is a merchant's son, not a palace official. He'll never work in a palace. There are no palaces left. He'll use this writing to keep accounts on a trading vessel. He'll teach it to a business partner in another port. That partner will adapt it slightly for his own language, pass it on. The institution died, the tradition survived. That contrast, the Pylos tablet and the Phoenician merchant, is the entire story of how knowledge crosses a civilizational collapse. Documents alone don't do it. Institutions alone don't do it. The thread that makes it through is woven from both, and it requires human beings actively choosing to keep weaving even when the loom is on fire.
Here's what bothers me about how we tell this story. We know Ramesses III. We have his face carved 40 feet high in stone. We have his name in hieroglyphics on temple walls across Egypt. We have his military campaigns documented in more detail than almost any other ancient military operation. We know his victories. We know his battles. We know approximately what he looked like. We don't know a single name of the scribes who actually preserved what he fought to protect. Not one. The people who maintained the houses of life through the collapse period. The archivists who made decisions about what to carry out before the destruction arrived. The teachers who kept scribal training functional when the palace economy funding it was fracturing. Anonymous, every one of them. The historical record keeps the kings. It loses the people who made the king's civilization worth keeping. And yet, the evidence of their work is everywhere. Every papyrus that survived, every text that crossed the gap, every piece of knowledge that made it from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age to us. Someone carried it. We just don't know who. The palaces fell. The armies that defended them fought and lost, or fought and won and still lost the world those victories were meant to preserve. But in the scribal schools attached to Egyptian temples, in the workshops of surviving Levantine port cities, in the hands of merchants learning a new alphabet simple enough to write on a pottery shard, the knowledge moved. Not perfectly, not completely. Enormous amounts were lost forever. Languages we can't decipher, texts we'll never read, technical knowledge that had to be painfully rediscovered centuries later. The losses were real and they were massive, but enough moved, enough crossed the gap. And the people who carried it weren't kings, they weren't generals, they weren't the names carved on temple walls or the figures depicted in battle reliefs holding enemies by the hair. They were the people in the room after the battle, after the decree, after the moment of dramatic decision. The quiet ones, copying one more text, teaching one more student, wrapping one more set of tablets carefully before the city was abandoned. History remembers the fire. It forgets the hands that carried the flame through it. Next, the people who took that surviving knowledge and built something the Bronze Age had never imagined. Not a palace economy, not an empire built on bronze and tin. Something smaller, something harder to destroy, something that's still running. The traders who rebuilt the world. The palaces are gone, the tin roots dead, the copper fleets scattered, the palace bureaucracies that managed grain distribution across entire regions finished. The scribes preserved what they could. The Pharaoh held one wall standing. But a wall isn't a world. Someone had to rebuild the world. Not with armies, not with palace decrees, not with the grand top-down machinery of Bronze Age civilization that had just proven catastrophically how completely it could fail. With ships, with goods, with the oldest human instinct there is. You have something I need. I have something you need. Let's find a way to make that work.
While kings were still carving their victories into temple walls, while the Bronze Age was still smoldering, one people looked at the wreckage of the interconnected ancient world and saw something nobody else saw: an opportunity. Their name was the Phoenicians. And what they built in the ruins of everything you've been watching burn is still running, right now, today, in ways you use every single morning without knowing it. First, clear something up, because the Phoenicians are one of the most misunderstood peoples in ancient history. They weren't an empire. They never called themselves Phoenicians. That name comes from the Greeks, probably referencing the purple dye they traded. They had no single king, no unified state, no capital city that commanded the others. That's exactly why they survived. The Phoenicians were a collection of independent city-states strung along the Levantine coast: Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, each one autonomous, each one self-governing, each one making its own decisions, its own trade agreements, its own alliances. No center to collapse. When the Bronze Age palace system fell, when the great interconnected hierarchy of kings and vassal states and palace-managed trade networks came apart, there was nothing at the center of the Phoenician world to collapse, no palace economy to fail, no single administrative system to break down, just cities, ships, merchants who knew the sea routes. And merchants who knew the sea routes don't stop being useful just because the palaces burned. Here's what the post-collapse Mediterranean looked like from the deck of a Phoenician trading vessel around 1150 BC, the dust still settling. The Mycenaean trading network, gone. The ships that had moved obsidian and silver and pottery across the Aegean for centuries, those networks don't exist anymore. The palace administrators who organized them are dead or displaced. The ports they operated from are abandoned or running at a fraction of capacity. The Hittite overland trade system, gone. The routes that moved goods from Central Asia through Anatolia to the Mediterranean coast, disrupted at every node. The kingdoms that guaranteed safe passage, finished. Egypt surviving, but contracted, still functional, still wealthy by the standards of the post-collapse world, but no longer projecting power into the Levant, no longer maintaining the trade infrastructure it once managed along the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. Every dominant player in the old system, gone, reduced, or retreating. The sea routes still exist. The Mediterranean didn't change. The winds and currents that made certain passages reliable for certain seasons, still there. The demand for copper, for tin, for timber, for grain, for dye, still there. People need things. People with things still want to exchange them. The infrastructure is broken. The need is not. That gap between what people need and the collapsed system that used to provide it, that gap is what the Phoenicians stepped into. Not because someone planned it, not because a Phoenician king issued a decree commanding his merchants to fill the vacuum left by the Bronze Age collapse, because individual merchants looked at the situation and made individual decisions that this was worth trying. That decentralization, the absence of a palace telling merchants what to do, turned out to be the most powerful competitive advantage imaginable in a world where palaces had just failed.
You want to understand the Phoenicians, start with the ships, because everything else follows from the ships. Phoenician shipbuilding drew on centuries of maritime expertise from the Levantine coast. Cedar from the Lebanese mountains, some of the best shipbuilding timber in the ancient world, dense and rot-resistant. Hulls designed for open water sailing, not just coastal hugging. The Phoenicians developed the bireme, a ship with 2 banks of oars, giving them speed and maneuverability that earlier Bronze Age vessels couldn't match. But the real innovation wasn't the hull, it was the navigation. The Phoenicians were navigating by stars, specifically by the North Star. The Greeks called it the Phoenician star because of how consistently Phoenician sailors used it for open water orientation. That single navigational technique, maintaining bearing by a fixed celestial reference point, meant Phoenician vessels could operate in open sea, at night, out of sight of land, with a reliability that most ancient sailors couldn't approach. They didn't need to follow the coastline, they could cut straight across. That sounds like a small technical detail. It is not a small technical detail. It is the difference between a coastal trading culture and a maritime civilization capable of ranging the entire Mediterranean. And range it they did. The Phoenician trading network that develops through the post-collapse period is structurally unlike anything the Bronze Age had built. The Bronze Age system was hierarchical: palace at the center, managed trade, state-controlled distribution, everything flowing through official channels, documented in official tablets, managed by official administrators. What the Phoenicians built was a web, no center, trading posts established at strategic points across the Mediterranean, not colonies in the imperial sense, not outposts of a conquering power, but merchant footholds. A warehouse here, a small settlement there, a relationship with the local population built on mutual benefit rather than military dominance. Cyprus, still a source of copper, still critical, the Phoenicians establish a presence. North Africa, Carthage, founded by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, eventually becomes one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Sardinia, Sicily, southern Spain, the silver mines of Iberia become a Phoenician commercial interest. Some scholars believe Phoenician sailors reached Britain, trading for tin from Cornish mines. The network that Bronze Age palace diplomacy had tried to manage through treaties and royal correspondence, the Phoenicians rebuilt through commercial relationships and shared self-interest. Harder to disrupt, no single node that, if destroyed, takes the whole system down. Resilient in exactly the way the Bronze Age system was not. And critically, it ran without kings ordering it to run. But here's the thing the Phoenicians did that outlasted every ship they built, every trading post they established, every silver ingot they moved from Iberia to the Levantine coast. They spread the alphabet. We talked about this briefly in the last episode, the emergence of a simplified writing system in the surviving Levantine cities of the post-collapse period. 22 characters, no vowels marked, learnable in weeks, not years. The Phoenicians didn't invent it. The roots go earlier. Proto-Sinaitic script, the earliest attempts to create a simplified alphabetic system, predate the collapse. But the Phoenicians are the distribution network. Every port they traded in, the alphabet followed. Not through conquest, not through decree, through commerce. Merchants need to keep records. Merchants need to communicate across languages and distances. A writing system simple enough for a trader to learn, simple enough to write on a pottery shard or a piece of leather, rather than requiring a trained palace scribe and a stock of clay tablets. That writing system travels with trade. The Greeks encountered the Phoenician alphabet through commercial contact. They adapted it. Critically, they added vowels, solving the ambiguity problem of a consonant-only system. That Greek adaptation became the model for Latin. Latin became the basis for every Western European writing system. The alphabet you're using right now to read these words traces in a direct line back to Phoenician merchants moving goods across the post-collapse Mediterranean. Not to a king, not to an empire, not to a military victory or a palace decree, to traders keeping records. That is the longest-lasting consequence of any commercial activity in human history.
Let's get specific, because the goods matter. The goods tell you what the post-collapse world actually needed. Timber. The deforested civilizations of the ancient Near East needed Lebanese cedar desperately. Egypt needed it for ships and construction. Mesopotamia needed it for building in a region with almost no native trees. Phoenician control of the cedar forests of Lebanon is not a peripheral commercial advantage. It's a strategic resource that makes them indispensable to every major power in the region. Purple dye, the famous Tyrian purple, produced from murex sea snails in an industrial process that was expensive, labor-intensive, and extraordinarily smelly. The dye works at Tyre and Sidon have been located archaeologically, partly because the shell middens they produced are enormous. But the product was worth the process. Purple fabric became the marker of royalty and high status across the ancient world. The color purple means royalty to this day because of what the Phoenicians built around it. Glass. Phoenician glass-making techniques, sand core glass, later blown glass, spread through the Mediterranean via Phoenician commercial networks. Silver. The Iberian mines, enormous quantities of silver moving east through Phoenician trading networks, monetizing trade across the post-collapse world in ways that the Bronze Age barter and palace redistribution system never had. Each of these goods is also a relationship. A supply chain is a relationship. The Phoenicians understood, explicitly or instinctively, that commerce creates interdependence. That interdependence creates stability. That stability creates the conditions for more commerce. The Bronze Age system had tried to create stability through political hierarchy. The Phoenicians created it through mutual interest. Here's a counterintuitive detail about the Phoenician city-states. They competed with each other. Tyre and Sidon, the two most powerful Phoenician cities, were rivals, competing for the same trade routes, the same markets, the same commercial relationships. There was no Phoenician king saying, Tyre takes the western Mediterranean, Sidon takes the eastern. No central authority allocating markets or preventing overlap, just competition. And that competition, instead of weakening the Phoenician commercial world, it strengthened it. Competition drove innovation in shipbuilding. Competition drove the establishment of more trading posts, broader networks, longer routes. Competition pushed individual Phoenician merchants to find markets the other cities hadn't reached yet. The decentralization that had no palace to collapse also had no monopoly to stagnate. Compare this to the Bronze Age palace trade system, managed, controlled, allocated from the center. Efficient in good conditions, catastrophically brittle when the conditions changed. The Phoenician system was messier, less coordinated, full of redundancy and overlap and inefficiency, and it survived everything the Bronze Age system could not. Here's the insight at the center of everything the Phoenicians built. The Bronze Age palace system treated trade as a function of political power. You trade with allies. You trade with vassals. Trade relationships follow political relationships. The palace manages it. The king authorizes it. Disrupt the politics, disrupt the trade. The Phoenicians inverted this completely. Trade creates the politics. Commerce builds the relationships. The commercial interest comes first, and the political stability follows from it. You don't need a treaty between kings to trade. You need a shared interest in the transaction completing successfully. You need both parties to believe that the relationship is worth maintaining because the relationship keeps producing value. That's not idealism, that's not philosophy, that's just what actually works when the kings are gone. And in the post-collapse Mediterranean, the kings were largely gone, or reduced, or fighting for survival with the remnants of what their predecessors had built. Into that vacuum, the Phoenicians brought a different model, one that didn't require kings, one that didn't require palace systems or diplomatic hierarchies or the entire superstructure of Bronze Age political organization, just ships, goods, and the mutual interest of people who need things from each other.
Here's where we land. The Phoenicians are not famous. Ask a random person to name an ancient civilization and they'll say Egypt, Rome, Greece, maybe Mesopotamia. The Phoenicians, the people who rebuilt the commercial world after the greatest collapse in ancient history, who distributed the alphabet that underlies every Western writing system, who established trading networks that prefigured everything we now call globalization, mostly forgotten. Partly because they didn't build enormous monuments, no pyramids, no Parthenon. Their great city of Carthage was destroyed by Rome so thoroughly that the archaeology has taken centuries to reconstruct. Tyre, built partly on an island, connected to the mainland by Alexander the Great's siege works, survived but transformed beyond recognition. They left their legacy not in stone, but in systems,
in practices, in a writing technology that spread to every corner of the Mediterranean, in commercial relationships that outlasted the merchants who built them, in the idea that a decentralized network of mutual interest is more resilient than any palace-managed hierarchy. That idea is the most valuable thing to survive the Bronze Age collapse. More valuable than any document the Egyptian scribes preserved, more valuable than the military achievement of Ramesses holding the Nile Delta, more valuable than the alphabetic texts that crossed the civilizational gap. Because it's not just an idea about ancient trade, it's an idea about how complex systems survive catastrophe, not by having a stronger center, by not needing one. The Bronze Age ended because it was too connected at the top and too fragile at the edges. One superpower failing put pressure on the next. One trade route disrupted, cascaded into 10. One drought in one region rippled through a system with no redundancy, no resilience, no capacity to absorb a shock without transmitting it everywhere simultaneously. The Phoenicians looked at that wreckage and built the opposite. Wide, distributed, redundant, driven by individual commercial decisions rather than central palace management. Resilient precisely because there was nothing at the center that could fail. And in doing so, almost accidentally, they gave the next civilization everything it needed. The Greeks who absorbed the Phoenician alphabet, who learned the sea routes from Phoenician contact, who built their own maritime trading culture partly in competition with and partly in imitation of the Phoenician model, those Greeks are next. Because the story of how the ancient world recovers from the Bronze Age collapse doesn't end with merchants rebuilding trade routes. It ends with something the Bronze Age never produced. An idea about how human beings should govern themselves. That idea is coming. The mountain survivors. The traders rebuilt the sea routes, but not everyone lives on the coast. While the Phoenicians were reconstructing commerce from the water, something different was happening inland. In the hills, in the highlands nobody had bothered to conquer because there wasn't enough there worth taking. That obscurity turned out to be the point. The collapse didn't reach everywhere equally. The great coastal cities, the ones plugged into the Bronze Age palace system, the ones wealthy enough to be worth raiding, those burned. The interconnected got destroyed by their interconnection. But the people in the margins, the highland communities too simple to be worth targeting, too decentralized to collapse in the way palaces collapsed, they were still standing when the smoke cleared. And two of them would shape the next 3,000 years of human history. The Neo-Hittites, survival in the ruins. The Hittite Empire is gone, we establish that. Capital burned, royal dynasty erased. The superpower that signed history's first peace treaty, finished. But here's what the collapse didn't finish: the people. In the northern Syrian highlands and southeastern Anatolia, in the margins of what the empire had been, Hittite-descended communities survived, smaller, simpler, disconnected from the palace machinery that had made the empire powerful and the collapse so total. They kept the language, kept the cultural identity, kept certain administrative traditions stripped down to what worked without a palace backing them. The Neo-Hittite city-states, Carchemish, Malatya, Kumuch, emerge in the post-collapse period not as an empire rebuilt, but as something more modest and more durable. Regional powers, local authorities, small enough to be flexible, decentralized enough to absorb shocks that would have toppled the imperial system. They lasted for centuries after the empire that birthed them was ash. The empire died, the culture it carried didn't. And they kept something else: artistic and architectural traditions, the distinctive Hittite relief carvings, the monumental sculpture, the hieroglyphic Luwian writing system, these continued in the Neo-Hittite states when they had nowhere else to survive. The collapse erased the political structure. It couldn't erase the people who had lived inside it. Those people carried forward what the empire had been, in a form simple enough to survive. Now, the more consequential story. The Israelites appear in the historical record at almost exactly the moment the Bronze Age collapses. The earliest extra-biblical mention of Israel, the Merneptah Stele, an Egyptian inscription from around 1208 BC, places them in Canaan right in the middle of the collapse period. They emerge not from the great palace centers, not from the wealthy coastal cities, from the highlands, the interior, the places the Bronze Age system had largely ignored. And they built something the Bronze Age had never built, a civilization without a palace at the center. The early Israelite community structure, as best as archaeology and text can reconstruct it, was tribal, decentralized, organized around kinship groups and local leadership rather than a palace hierarchy managing resources from the top. No bronze-dependent military aristocracy, no palace economy requiring tin from Central Asia to function, no single administrative center that, if destroyed, took everything else with it. Deliberately, structurally, almost philosophically decentralized. But here's what makes the Israelite case truly distinct from every other survivor of the collapse. They'd built their civilization into a text. Not administrative tablets, not palace inventories, not the kind of institutional record-keeping the Egyptian scribes maintained. A foundational text, law, history, identity, covenant. A civilization you could carry. If the palace burns, you still have the text. If the city falls, you still have the text. If you're displaced, scattered, marched into exile across the ancient world, you still have the text. That is a direct response to the Bronze Age collapse, a solution to the problem that destroyed Ugarit, that ended the Mycenaeans, that even nearly broke Egypt. Every one of those civilizations was embedded in place, in institutions, in the physical infrastructure of palaces and archives and scribal schools. The Israelites built an identity that didn't require any of that. Portable, resilient, impossible to burn down.
Look at both of these survivors together, and the pattern becomes clear. The Neo-Hittites survived by scaling down, taking what the empire had been and stripping it to what could function without imperial infrastructure. Smaller, simpler, enough. The Israelites survived by building inward, putting the civilization inside the community rather than into physical structures, into law and memory and identity rather than palace walls and tin supply chains. Both answers are the same insight, reached from different directions. Complexity kills, simplicity survives. The Bronze Age had built the most sophisticated, interconnected, mutually dependent civilizational system the ancient world had ever seen. And that sophistication, that complexity, that interconnection was precisely what made the collapse so total. The survivors weren't the ones who rebuilt that complexity faster. They were the ones who understood they didn't need it. The empires are gone, but the people who lived in their shadows, the highland communities, the decentralized tribes, the cultures too simple to be worth destroying and too resilient to be destroyed anyway, they're still here. Every time you encounter the idea that law is above the king, that a community's identity doesn't depend on its political power, that a civilization can survive displacement because it lives in its people rather than its palaces, that's the Bronze Age collapse talking. That's the lesson written in ash and carried forward by people who had nothing left but the most important thing, the knowledge of who they were.
History forgot the empires that burned most completely. It remembers the people who decided they didn't need an empire to survive. Next, what all of these survivors built together, the world that rose from the ruins, and why the civilization that came next was stranger, more durable, and more influential than anything the Bronze Age had ever produced. The birth of the Iron Age. 6 episodes ago, you watched a world end. The most sophisticated civilizational system the ancient world had ever built. Bronze Age palace economies stretching from Egypt to Anatolia to the Aegean. Trade routes moving tin from Central Asia and copper from Cyprus and grain across the entire Mediterranean. Kings writing letters to each other in a shared diplomatic language, calling each other brother. Gone. Inside a single human lifetime. And we've been following the thread ever since. The Pharaoh who held the last wall, the scribes who carried knowledge through the fire, the traders who rebuilt the sea routes without waiting for anyone to authorize them, the mountain survivors who looked at the wreckage of palace civilization and built something that didn't need a palace to function. Each one answered part of the question we started with: who kept the light? But here's the question underneath that question, the one this whole series has been building toward. What did the light become? Because the survivors didn't just keep the old world running on lower power. They didn't rebuild the Bronze Age in miniature. What emerged from the collapse wasn't a smaller version of what had existed before. It was something new. Something harder, something that would outlast everything the Bronze Age had built by a factor of centuries. This is how the ancient world ended, and how the modern world began. Start with the material, because in the ancient world, materials aren't just practical, they're civilizational. Bronze defined an era for a reason. It's strong, it's workable, it holds an edge. For centuries, it was the best metal available for weapons, tools, agricultural implements, the entire physical infrastructure of advanced civilization. But bronze has a fatal dependency built into it: tin. That supply chain stretching thousands of miles from Central Asia, multiple kingdoms, multiple points of failure, the single thread the entire system ran on, and the thread the collapse cut. When the tin stopped moving, bronze stopped. And when bronze stopped, the armies that ran on it, the palace economies that depended on it, the entire superstructure of Bronze Age civilization that bronze weapons and bronze tools and bronze agricultural implements made possible, everything built on that foundation shook. Iron was known before the collapse. The Hittites worked iron. Egyptian records mention it. But it was rare, expensive, difficult to work with the technology available, a prestige material, a curiosity, not a replacement for bronze, just a supplement. Then the tin roots collapsed, and necessity made engineers out of everyone. The critical breakthrough is iron smelting, specifically the development of techniques to work iron at high enough temperatures to produce a usable, consistent metal. And then carburization, the process of introducing carbon into iron to produce steel. Steel harder than bronze, steel that holds a sharper edge, steel that can be made anywhere with iron ore and charcoal. And iron ore is everywhere, not rare, not dependent on a fragile supply chain stretching across multiple kingdoms, not requiring diplomatic relationships and palace-managed trade networks to obtain. Iron ore sits in the ground across the Mediterranean, across Europe, across the Near East. Every local community with the right smelting technique can produce iron tools and iron weapons from local sources. The material the new world is built on cannot be cut off, cannot be disrupted, cannot be controlled from a palace thousands of miles away. That is not a coincidence. That is adaptation. The post-collapse world selected for iron because iron solved the exact vulnerability that had helped destroy the Bronze Age. Now, watch what the new material makes possible. Bronze Age civilization was necessarily large-scale. You need the palace system to manage the tin supply chain. You need the palace system to manage a bronze-equipped army. You need the palace system to organize the agricultural surplus that feeds the army that protects the palace. Everything requires scale. Everything requires the center. Iron breaks that logic completely. A small community with local iron ore and a competent smith can arm itself, can tool its agriculture, can function militarily and economically at a scale the Bronze Age palace system would have considered impossibly small. The political unit that dominates the Iron Age isn't the empire. It isn't the palace kingdom managing trade networks across 1,000 miles. It's the city-state, the territorial kingdom, the nation. Smaller, more defined, more coherent, organized around shared identity, language, law, culture, rather than palace hierarchy and bronze-dependent military power. Look at what's emerging in the post-collapse world by 1000 BC. The Greek polis, the city-states, Athens, Corinth, Sparta, each one autonomous, each one developing its own political character, small enough to be governed directly, coherent enough to build genuine civic identity. The Israelite monarchy, Saul, David, Solomon, a territorial state built on the tribal foundation we talked about last episode. Iron weapons explicitly mentioned in the biblical record as the military advantage of their enemies and then their own. The transition from tribal confederation to territorial kingdom happening in real time. The Assyrian Empire, but a different kind of empire than the Bronze Age had produced, harder, more militaristic, built on iron-equipped armies that can campaign further, fight harder, and project power more consistently than anything the Bronze Age bronze-dependent military had managed. The Phoenician city-states consolidating and expanding, Carthage growing, the Western Mediterranean opening. Every one is a new political form. Every one is an answer to the question the collapse forced everyone to answer. How do you build something that doesn't break the way the Bronze Age broke?
Here's the deeper transformation, the one that outlasts the iron itself. Bronze Age power was material. It came from controlling the inputs, the tin, the copper, the supply chains. Control the material, control the military. Control the military, control the territory. Control the territory, control the agricultural surplus. Everything flows from controlling the physical inputs that bronze requires. Iron Age power is different. When the material is locally available, when any community with the right technique can arm itself, controlling the inputs stops being the foundation of political authority. Something else has to do that work. Law, identity, civic participation, the idea that political authority derives from something other than military monopoly on bronze-dependent weaponry. That's not inevitable, that's not automatic, but it becomes possible in a way it wasn't before. The Greek city-states develop constitutions, written law, political participation, limited, contested, imperfect, but genuinely new. The idea that the citizen has a defined relationship to the state, that the state has obligations to the citizen, that political authority requires some form of legitimacy beyond raw military force. That idea requires iron, not because iron causes democracy, but because iron breaks the material monopoly that made Bronze Age palace authority nearly impossible to challenge from below. When the tin supply chain controlled by distant palaces is the basis of military power, the palace is unchallengeable. When iron ore sits in the ground everywhere, the monopoly breaks. And when the monopoly breaks, political imagination becomes possible. The Bronze Age collapsed. The concept of citizenship was born in the rubble. Before the triumphant arc of Iron Age emergence carries us away, stop. Because the honest account of what happened requires sitting with the losses, and they were real, and they were enormous.
The Bronze Age international system, for all its hierarchy and its palace-managed inequality and its tin-dependent fragility, was also genuinely cosmopolitan, genuinely sophisticated. The diplomatic culture of the Late Bronze Age, the multilingual correspondence, the merchant communities of cities like Ugarit, where 5 languages shared a market, that was something. The collapse didn't produce a better world immediately. It produced a harder, simpler, more violent world. The Greek Dark Age was real. 4 centuries of reduced population, lost literacy, contracted trade, diminished material culture. Real people lived through that. Real generations were born into poverty and limited horizons compared to what had existed before. The Mycenaean world that was lost, its art, its palatial architecture, its trading networks, its literary culture that Homer could only half remember centuries later, that loss was not a minor transitional cost. People suffered for that transition. Entire generations knew only the aftermath of catastrophe. The Iron Age didn't arrive as a gift. It arrived as a slow, painful adaptation to conditions nobody would have chosen. The new world was built on genuine loss. That deserves acknowledgement before it deserves celebration. But here's what the full arc shows. The Bronze Age collapse was not the end of civilization. It was the end of one form of civilization, the palace-centered, tin-dependent, hierarchically managed, catastrophically interconnected form that had dominated the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. What replaced it was not better in every dimension, not immediately, not cleanly, not without enormous cost and suffering and loss, but it was more resilient, more distributed, more capable of surviving the kinds of shocks that had destroyed the Bronze Age. And it produced things the Bronze Age never produced. The alphabet, distributed by Phoenician merchants, adapted by Greeks, carried by Romans across Europe. That's an Iron Age development, growing directly from collapse period adaptation. Democracy, emerging from the Greek city-states, shaped by the post-collapse political landscape, that's an Iron Age development. Monotheism, the Israelite theological tradition, developing and consolidating through the Iron Age, eventually producing Christianity and Islam. 3 of the world's major religions trace to Iron Age communities that survived the collapse in the Palestinian highlands. Written philosophy, written history, written law as the explicit foundation of political community, all Iron Age, all emerging from the post-collapse world. Every intellectual foundation of Western civilization is an Iron Age product. Every one of them is downstream of the Bronze Age collapse. Not because of the catastrophe, because of it. The collapse forced adaptation. The adaptation produced innovation. The innovation produced the conceptual tools that built everything that came after.
Now, the last piece, the human piece. We've talked about materials and political systems and intellectual history, the abstract architecture of civilizational transformation. But transformation doesn't happen abstractly. It happens in specific moments, specific decisions, specific people choosing to do the next necessary thing when the world around them has stopped making sense. The smith who spent years figuring out how to work iron consistently, not because anyone commissioned it, not because a palace was funding the research, but because bronze was gone and iron was what remained. The merchant who looked at the collapsed trade networks of the Bronze Age and started rebuilding, smaller, slower, with less capital and less institutional support, but building. The scribe who kept teaching, the farmer who kept planting, the teacher who kept the school running when the palace that had funded it was rubble. The community that decided its identity was worth maintaining even without a king to embody it, even without a palace to house it, even scattered across a landscape that had just been violently reorganized. None of these people knew they were building a new world. They were just doing the next necessary thing, and the next, and the next.
The Bronze Age looked like civilization because it was large and sophisticated and visible. Enormous palaces and massive armies and diplomatic correspondence between kings who called each other brother. The Iron Age looked like survival, and survival, repeated, generation after generation, is how a new world gets built.
6 episodes ago, we asked, who kept the light? Here's the full answer. Ramesses III, who held the last wall standing and kept Egyptian institutional knowledge alive when everything around it was burning. The Scribes, anonymous, uncarved on any wall, who wrapped tablets in cloth and carried texts out of burning cities and kept teaching when the institutions funding them had collapsed. The Phoenician merchants, who looked at the wreckage of the Bronze Age trading system and rebuilt it without waiting for authorization from kings who no longer existed. The Israelites in the highlands, who built their civilization into a text so it couldn't be destroyed by burning the building it lived in. The Neo-Hittites in the mountains, who took what the empire had been and stripped it to what could survive without the empire. The Greek communities emerging from 4 centuries of Dark Age, who built something new on the ruins, something that didn't need a palace at the center to function. All of them kept the light. Not one hero, not one decisive battle, not one king who turned the tide. Thousands of individual decisions, thousands of moments where a specific person chose to preserve something, carry something, build something, rather than abandon it. That is how civilization survives catastrophe. Not through the strength of its greatest institutions, through the stubbornness of its ordinary people. The Bronze Age ended in fire. Cities burned. Palaces collapsed, writing systems vanished, trade networks that had taken 300 years to build went silent inside a generation. The most sophisticated civilizational system the ancient world had ever produced, gone. And in the ruins, something grew, harder, more distributed, more resilient, built not on the control of distant supply chains, but on local resources and human ingenuity. Built not on palace hierarchy, but on law and identity, and the radical idea that a civilization lives in its people, not its buildings. The men who survived 1177 BC did not save the old world. They built a new one. And that new world, the Iron Age world of city-states and written law and distributed trade and portable identity, that world produced everything. The philosophy, the religion, the political concepts, the writing systems, the intellectual framework that every civilization since has been either building on or arguing with. You are living in the Iron Age's inheritance. Every idea you take for granted about law and citizenship and the written word and the relationship between the individual and the state, downstream of the Bronze Age collapse, downstream of the people who refused to let the light go out. The world ended, and the people who survived it built something that has never stopped.